You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Like any industry, in ours, there's companies that do a little better than others. The key is to figure out why they do better than others and what you can learn from that. So what we're going to look at today is who are the top 50 retailers? What do they do? How are they more efficient? And what can you learn from that? Joining us today are two fuels experts. We have Brian Norris, who is Executive Director of Retail Fuels for OPIS, which creates a lot of very interesting fuels-focused statistics, including the top 50. And Keith Reid, who is the Editorial Director of Fuels Market News, which is the foremost publication within the convenience and fuels retailing industry. So thank you for both of you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jeff.
So Brian, we'll start out with you, real big picture. Give us an overview. I think a lot of us are familiar with OPIS supplying data for the AAA daily fuel report, all kinds of other reports that you do. Can you just give us a little background on how OPIS collects information, and then specifically how the Fuels Top 50 is put together?
Sure. Yeah. So OPIS is primarily known in the industry for our rack data. That's our bread and butter. That's where OPIS started. A lot of folks don't realize that OPIS actually has a whole retail division that has a lot of really robust data that helps our customers, who are the convenience retailers, really anybody that sells retail fuel, basically benchmark and monitor their fuel pricing programs. And so this report, the Fuels 50, the top 50, is based off of a report that OPIS puts together called the Retail Brand Power Report. And the reason we put this together is we're asked all the time, which retailer is the best at what they do. And it's such an open-ended question because there's so many components that go into, operating a chain of convenience stores. I'm sure anybody listening to this podcast is not surprised by that statement. So, our goal here is to put together some metrics utilizing the data that we have to try to put a measurement on that and to try to really determine, which retailers are the most efficient, the best operators. So we have four different types of data that primarily go into this report that are proprietary to OPIS. So the first data is our pricing data. So OPIS is the foremost collector and aggregator of retail fuel pricing. Most of our retail customers use that data to replace, the old school traditional competitor price surveys where they'd send their store managers around to collect their, competitive market intel, once a day. The data that we get for retail prices, we get almost 5 million prices per day that come through our systems. And we collected through a variety of data sources. We have limited time here, so I'm not going to get too much into the specifics, but we put it through a rigorous cleansing process. And we utilize that data. So really anywhere you see retail fuel pricing data, for the most part, I'd say 98% of it is from OPIS. We don't have a consumer-facing brand. So a lot of times, you mentioned AAA earlier, but also a lot of the car companies. If you drive certain brands of car that have fuel prices in the onboard dash system, that's us. We license that data. If you're using Google Maps or Apple Maps, that's us. We license that data. So that data is pretty much the industry standard. So that's one component. The other component is, like I mentioned before, most people know OPIS for racks. We use that rack information or the wholesale cost information plus the retail prices, and we calculate a margin for basically every gallon that's sold in the US. And we do that by we have a standard methodology. Obviously, we don't know everybody's fuel contracts, what they're paying their suppliers for, every gallon they put into their tanks, but what we do have is a standard methodology where we take the brand of a store, we map it to the closest rack, we look at the price, and we use that as the cost component. And then we factor out taxes, a placeholder for freight, and what you're left with is an implied margin on essentially what we estimate every retail station is making on what they sell. The last two pieces are related to volumes, and they can be a little bit confusing for folks. So I like to kind of describe them both at the same time. So we have our market share and our demand data. Demand data is essentially volumes. But what we mean by that is how big is the pie? Not how big is your slice of the pie, but how big is the pie in your area? So if you're a fuel retailer and, I'm sitting here in Maryland. So if you're in Maryland, what is the demand for gasoline in Maryland on a week-to-week basis? How big is the overall pie? And then our market share data is how big is your slice of the pie. OPIS calculates that data all the way down to the station level now. It used to just be regional aggregates, but with a new data source that we've acquired over the last few years that's included in this report, which is our cell phone visit count data. We've geofenced every fuel station in the United States, the property as well as the pumps. And we use that visit count data. It goes through a lot of cleaning. There's a lot of junk data in the space. And we are the data people. We make sure we thoroughly vet all of the data that we use. And we use that data to calculate market share. And so those are the 4 components that go into creating this report. And then the 5th component, I guess, would be non-OPIS data, would be the general demographic data. That is also an important component of this.
And that's stuff from census, et cetera.
Yep. Yeah, census data.
So the geofencing is really cool. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more later. Keith, this is the 3rd year that Fuels Market News has put together the Fuels 50. Do you want to give an overview to people about why it's important and what they can get out of it before we start diving into some of the specifics of the new report?
Yeah, I think from a big picture standpoint, there's probably 2 main takeaway areas. First, as a subset of the larger report, this gives our readers in a handful of really key areas a solid overview to benchmark their operations against other companies that have been identified as, true leaders in the industry from an efficiency standpoint. And obviously, you can go to the OPIS report to get much more granular data beyond that. But this gives people an opportunity to take a look at their operations, the operations nationally, and any of those operations that might be in their market. And I think the second real takeaway from this that might be encouraging to readers is that you've got a range of companies in here. You have some of the largest companies in the industry, such as Circle K with over 6,000 sites. In the top 50, you go down to Delta Sonic with about 31 sites. And you really get a mix. And the top 5 are usually somewhere in between that. And I think what's encouraging is the thought that you can be a smaller operator in this industry, but if you execute properly, if you take advantage of your staff resources, your mission statement, your knowledge of the market, and your technology, you can be just as efficient as any other leading company in the industry. So I think those are probably the 2 big picture items for our readers.
Yeah. So economies of scale, there's obvious benefits. The bigger you are, you're going to be able to capitalize. You're going to have a larger brand reach. You're going to be a more well-known brand. There's a lot of value that comes with having a well-known brand in the market. People know what they're getting when they, show up to a certain brand of store. That's really important. There's also the larger you are, typically, the better you're going to be able to negotiate your fuel contracts. You're going to be able to use that to your advantage with your vendors to get better deals because obviously you're buying more stuff. So the more stuff you buy, the better the deal you get. I will say, and part of the reason that I don't necessarily think that maybe the largest retailers are number 1 and number 2 is because there's also some challenges that come with getting that big in this industry, particularly for the retailers that maybe grow through acquisition. It's really hard to execute on a strategy if you have different technology in a lot of different stores. It makes it really tricky to execute. How do you push a price to 5,000 stations if they're not all using the same point of sale devices, if they're not all using the same back office systems? How do you do that? It's really, really tricky. It becomes really complicated. So you do lose a little bit that way. One thing that I do want to kind of point out is the brands that do end up towards the very, very top are the brands that tend to grow organically. They don't tend to grow through acquisition. Not saying that can't work. There are some brands that do major acquisitions that are very successful. There was actually one this year that I'm keeping a close eye on, and that's, Maverick, who's in our top 5's acquisition of Come and Go. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with those 2 brands. I have noticed that in our database, the Come and Go stations are going away pretty quickly. It looks like Maverick is working really quickly on rebranding those, probably to maintain that control and having that consistent technology at these stores across the board would be my guess. Obviously, I don't know for sure, but if I had to guess, that would be it. But to kind of circle back on that, it does seem that the brands that have that consistent technology, they build organically, they know how to execute their strategy at all of their stores, do probably tend to have the most success. And that's why it's the larger brands that are like that, the Wawas, the Sheets, the Quick Trips of the world, where their stores are consistent across the board, that tend to come out on top. And I think it's because they have the economies of scale, but they also have that consistency in the technology that they use.
So simplicity is even more significant than the economies of scale. Anything, Keith, from your perspective that you noticed in looking at economies of scale versus flexibility?
I would work a little bit with what Brian had mentioned earlier. The top 5 tend to have operations where you have roughly 700 to 1,000 sites, and larger it's hard to call a company with 700 sites mid-sized, but larger mid-sized operations, down to maybe 400. So that tends, I've noticed the last 3 years, that tends to be the demographic for, the top 5 as far as things go. But he does raise a good point. You see some of the statistics reflect, when the data point is national and, in nature, you're going to see, a Circle K, for example, or a 7-Eleven, feature prominently in those areas. But once you start getting away from it, the smaller you get, the more localized you get in your data, you really start to see a much broader mix of companies in there. And I think some of that goes back to the added advantage of being maybe a little bit more entrepreneurial and knowing your markets so well that you can compete against a Circle K if you really know who your customers are and you really are in the right places doing the right things.
So Brian, you mentioned simplicity earlier. I paraphrased it as simplicity. And I made a mistake in not starting out by saying, simply describe what the top 50 measures as we look at categorizing 1 through 50 and have a further discussion. So before we go to pricing strategies, if I could back up and just ask you to just give us an overview of what the top 50 measures. And that was an important setup, because as we talk about pricing strategies, I think a lot of people think that efficiency means a lot of gallons sold at a high margin. And it's much more significant than that. We know from NACS surveys, we do annual consumer surveys, we do sometimes more frequently, and 7 out of 10 customers say price is the most important reason. Now, then you drill down, you find maybe it's not quite as important, but it is clearly very important. When we look at point number 2 around pricing strategies and the top 50, what really comes to the fore in looking at pricing strategies?
I'd say that, the most successful brands aren't necessarily discount pricers. I think that what they realize is that as long as they're a fair price with the strong brand, there's other things that come into the factor that create customer loyalty. Is it a safe station? Is it well lit? Is it a clean bathroom? Can I go in and get a variety of things that I may need? That's part of the value proposition that consumers are looking at when they're determining where they go to fill up. Yeah, of course, the fuel price is important, and for some subsets of customers, if you're not the lowest price, you're not getting their business, and there's nothing you can do about that. But that's not everybody. There's a lot of things that go into the value calculation. And I think what these different brands are that are the most successful, they've really figured out what that formula is for their brand. You have some of these brands, Sheets, for example, tends to be an average pricer in their market. They're not a discount pricer. They tend to price with market averages. You have the Wawas, the Mavericks, some of these other brands that they might be slightly discounted to the market average, but not super low. And then, of course, you have, the Buc-ee's of the world that are, way below market average. They are truly relying on quantity and not necessarily, the highest margins in order to accommodate their efficiencies. So it really depends on the brand and what your position is in the market when you're determining that, and there are different factors that go into that. Where are you? Rotten Robbie's, for example, they're in the San Francisco Bay Area. Their margins are still really strong. California margins are very high. But that market tends to typically be a dealer operated market where there's a lot of branded sites, and branded sites tend to be priced significantly higher than an unbranded site. So when you look at that, you see Rotten Robbie's, they're still making very healthy margins, but they're very low compared to the market average because they're an unbranded operator in that area and they price at a discount. So a lot of it depends on where you are. One thing I do want to bring up that I think is really important for the industry to understand is that there's also the factor of how, what percentage of my consumers, monthly income, or what percentage of their wallet is going towards fuel overall. When prices are higher, consumers are much more sensitive to, who is cheaper, So I think brands sometimes need to maybe pay attention to that overall. And I think that's where, a combination of these different data sets to understand, what is the overall volume picture? What's my market share? Am I losing market share? So for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago, prices that summer went through the roof. The national average, ended up around $5. We saw in our market share data, the way that the big box, the grocery, they were just absolutely stealing market share from the traditional convenience space. And I think it's because they realized that, okay, we're the aggressive pricers here. People are willing to wait in a line at Costco to save 30 cents a gallon when, prices are $5, whereas they're probably less likely to do so when prices are $3.50. So I think that's a really important part of the picture that I think some in this space don't pay close enough attention to is how much is this overall price hurting? It's not always just how you're pricing against your competition. It's also what is the overall price? How high is that right now? What is that level? And that may need to play a part in your strategy if you want to maintain your market share.
And it's basically consumers, how are they attuned to prices when they're rising? It hurts more. If you look at, say, prices were $3.50 in April, but they're rising, that hurts more than $3.50 in September when they're declining, for example.
Sure.
And how do you...
A lot of it is psychology. Yeah. It's almost, as a funny anecdote, it would almost be like, how often are my colleagues, Tom Closa and Synchrogana, asked to speak on TV about gas prices? If they're being asked to speak a lot, it's probably time to take a look at how high prices are and do I need to adjust my pricing strategy?
It's like the swallows in Capistrano every spring. That tends to be the busy season.
Yep.
Anything that struck you about pricing strategies, Keith? And when we talk about pricing strategies from the NACS side, we are not recommending strategies. We're talking about strategies. We are not in any way indicating which way a market should perform.
Generally, to touch on what Brian said, if you look at the top 5 companies on the list this year, there's very little difference in their pricing. 4 of the 5 are below average, but we're talking, a handful of cents, 2 to 3 cents, 4 cents. And the one that's above margin average is less than a cent. So it's really a case of where they figured out emotionally, I believe probably when you have that big sign on the corner, you don't want to stick out from the crowd in the opposite direction. But they seem to know their markets well enough to be able to, cut things as close as they can and still get the traffic in the door.
So, Brian, I want to go with you and talk about attracting customers, and then we'll get to Keith, who will take us through the head-to-head efficiency. Who are the top 5? I feel like Casey Kasem or whoever's doing the top 40 now and doing the countdown. But going back to attracting customers, that was what I said. I said, that's cool because you're geofencing. You're looking at not only what is happening at the pump, but what is happening inside the store, and you're marrying them up. What are you learning, and how does that matter?
So, we're really excited about the visit counts data. It's in a new tool that we have called Analytics Pro, which allows you to really drill down to the site level, but it's giving you some really key insights that can help you. Let me take a step back here and talk about something that a lot of retailers come to me and ask. I speak to them all day, every day. That's my role here at OPIS. A lot of them are like, look, I have 2 stores. They're virtually identical. they're on the same type of land, they're on the same type of highway, they're on the same, but one is a stud and one is a dud, or however you want to frame that. So why? And they can't figure it out. Why are certain stores outperforming others? And that's what this VisitCounts data really allows you to uncover. So there's a few key things that you can learn from it. So we're tracking the cell phones. We don't know who they are. We don't want anything with personally identifiable information that is likely to be legislated away anyways. So we're doing it. It's a very safe way to do it. But we do track, where do these devices that are visiting these stores, where do they live overnight? Not their address, but the census block. What's their home location? What census block do they reside in? And we can track the patterns in terms of, what stores are they going to? Because OPIS is the data source of record for all fuel stations, in the US, and we have all of them geofenced. We're tracking all of them every week. We know if a certain device pinged on multiple convenience stores in the same general area. And so when you compile all that data together, we can answer certain things. Where are your customers going? What other stores are they going to? So a lot of retailers assume, the 3 closest stores to my store are my competitors, and they're the ones I need to pay attention to. Well, what we can show in this data set is which competitors are actually the highest correlated to your store based off of these consumers, based off of these devices that are pinging on your location. So we can actually build a competitor list for you and say, these are the top 5 stores in your general area that you share the most customers with. Sometimes it is the closest stores, but sometimes it might be stores that are 5 or 10 miles down the road that you're not even paying attention to how they're pricing their fuel or what they're offering in their store, what their brand value is. So these are really important insights. First of all, just having that market intelligence to know who am I actually competing against is number one. Number two is there's some seasonality involved in that. Some stores, depending on the traffic, and then there's a lot of old school ways to do that with car counting and things that are out there. But understanding what your market share is versus different competitors at different times of the day can really help to uncover opportunities for you to either gain market share or to gain margin. Understanding how elastic your stores are. Not talking about volumes anymore. We're in a declining volumes environment. Gasoline gallons are on the decline. You can't look at that anymore and determine if your store is performing well or not, because if gallons are declining, you can't say, this store, their gallons declined, it's not doing well. It could still be maintaining its market share. So really understanding, your market share in a given area, and rather than elasticity of demand, which has been a traditional metric, if I increase my price, do I lose volume? I think the most sophisticated retailers are starting to pivot to elasticity of market share. If I increase my price, do I lose market share? Because that can really help them uncover when is there opportunities for me to increase my price and maybe potentially make a little bit of margin without impacting my market share. And on the flip side, maybe there's an opportunity for me to lower my price a little lower than I would traditionally go at certain times of the day, certain days of the week, and really grow my market share that way. And so there's a lot of different use cases for this. There's also the loyalty component, right? Because we're tracking a store over time, we do know what percentage of your customers only ever come to you. And is that growing? Did you launch a new loyalty program? Is it panning out in the data? Are you seeing that your customers are now more loyal? They're always coming to you. They're not visiting your competing stations. So there's a lot of really interesting metrics that this VisitCounts data, which is used in this report, can help you uncover that we're really excited to bring to the market because, we've really thoroughly vetted this data provider and we really think it's best in class.
What struck you about this, Keith?
It gets back to, I think we might have touched on it shortly earlier, that, at the national level, when you look at it, obviously the larger operations tend to be more dominant. And you see pretty strong representation among the top 5. As you start getting into community and local, you see a lot more players enter into the mix once you get down there. The companies that are in the top 5 are generally well represented, as say in the top 10 for community market share and local market share. But we touched on Buc-ee's earlier. It seems to be not just a convenience and fueling outlet, but an institution in some of the markets that operate.
They break all the rules. Buc-ee's breaks all the rules.
Well, they dominate both of those, but again, we'll look on them as a bit of an outlier. But it does get just a lot. It gets back to what I touched on also earlier on, that if you really know your market, you can compete with anybody out there. If you have excellent people, you know your market, you can execute. You can be in the top 10 for grabbing market share as long as you put in the effort and have what it takes. So,
yeah, and Buc-ee's, and one of the things is nobody's saying be Buc-ee's with the size of their store, with the size of their forecourt. No. They do run away with on the metric community market share, and part of that is because they are so big, and they are in communities that are so small. So it makes sense. But then when you look past them, and you look at some of the others, and there's some names that you might not expect in the top 10, and we won't reveal them all now because, of course, they're going to be in Fuels Market News. So let's save it for there. But let's go on to the countdown now. So we looked at economies of scale. We looked at pricing strategies. We looked at attracting customers and the geofencing. So Keith, I know that the traditional countdown with American Top 40 is probably all based on streaming and something that comes in and out, but this is a little bit more enduring. So you want to walk us through the top 5 or 5 to 1 in terms of efficiency that we're talking about in this issue of Fuels Market News.
Absolutely. And another observation after doing this for 3 years is that the things change the more they stay the same. And I would almost say they don't change all that much in the top 50. It's the top 5 tends to be about 7 companies bouncing back and forth year to year. The top 50, I've noticed there's about 5 or 6 companies that'll bounce in or bounce out of the top 50. They can be quite different operations. Sometimes the bounces are quite large. This year is top 5, starting with the number 5 is Wisconsin-based Quick Trip with a K. It was number 7 last year, but it's consistently right up there. Number 4 is Utah-based Maverick, which we've discussed a bit earlier. They were number 5 last year. There's Pennsylvania-based Sheets, which was number 3 last year, is 3 this year again. And the same for the next 2, Oklahoma-based Quick Trip with a Q. Number 2 last year, number 2 this year. And Pennsylvania-based Wawa, number 1 last year and number 1 this year. You know what's fascinating to me, it's occurred to me, and when I was first writing articles on the industry 20 years ago, there were always a handful of companies that you learned pretty quick were the go-tos for how to do something, and a lot of the companies that I've just named here were being talked about 20 years ago as folks that were doing it right then. And what's almost surprising is, whether private or public, however it shakes out, different changes in management. These companies have managed to not only be noteworthy 20 years ago, but they're still successful today. And that's rare. I mean, it's rare, even unstoppable juggernaut companies. It's hard to see a record where they don't have a dip somewhere, a change in management. The cream really does rise to the top. And I would also add that in a lot of cases, these companies have been known for really how they execute inside the box, inside the store. But as we find out here, what can be overlooked is because it may not be as sexy perhaps sometimes as how well they execute at the forecourt as well. So,
for sure. I do want to point out something, though. As you say, Keith, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It tends to be the same players. But I will say something I noticed that was pretty interesting this year is, Wawa has had a pretty sizable lead in terms of the point rankings that we give. I won't get into the numbers because they're not going to make sense in this medium of a podcast. But they had a pretty sizable lead over the rest of the field. The top 3 have a pretty sizable lead over 4 and 5. But I will say Wawa's lead has narrowed a lot this year. And I think when I sat down to think about maybe why, they're all growing through, organic methods typically, besides Maverick's acquisition of Come and Go. But that kind of remains to be seen how that's going to pan out in the data. But, Wawa, in my view, in some of their markets, they're very densely, populated there. There's a lot of Wawas in New Jersey. There's a lot of Wawas in Eastern Pennsylvania and Delaware. There's not a whole lot of value for them to continue to grow their brand there. They're already very dominant. they're starting to expand into new markets, and they're doing so pretty rapidly. And I think they're not going to have the same brand recognition in these new markets that they have where they've been for 20, 30 years. So I start to think about that and what that means. And maybe that is why the gap is narrowing a little bit, is because they're starting to branch out. And it'll be interesting to see if once they have that brand recognition in these new markets, if they widen that gap again between 2 and 3 and the rest of the field, or if they're just going to continue to grow. Obviously I have no insight into what their strategy is, but it's very interesting to see that as they start to expand beyond their traditional footprint, it does show out in the data, which is pretty fascinating to me.
Well, I want to amplify what Keith said. It's the top 5 known, respected brands. They've had a strategy they've executed for a decade, 2 or more. But within that top 50, there's some names there that I've already circled as I hit the road this summer, stopping by, checking out their operations. They are not names that you see in newspapers on a regular basis or trade publications or anything like that. Some really, really interesting brands to check out and to compare what your efficiencies look like compared to what you see when you visit them. So this will be a good roadmap for a lot of retailers who like spending time on the road to maybe check out a few places and see what the best are doing based on the best data out there, which is, of course, OPIS. So I want to thank both of you gentlemen. This was a fun issue to read through. And as I said, I need another copy already because mine's marked up. And look forward to reporting back from the road what I learned from at least 3 that I'm hitting in the next month.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks for having me. It's always a good time.
Thanks, Jeff. It's always a great discussion.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.